I don't really like the phrase God intervenes. Specifically, I don't like how it is used interchangeably with the idea that God interferes. What I mean is this idea common today regarding God that there is this normal, natural course of events, and when God does anything, God is somehow interfering with it. The flip side of that, of course, is that nothing that ever happens has anything to do with God unless it somehow interferes with what normally happens by, say, breaking some law of nature. But those of you who have followed this series so far would know that that is not the idea of God. God is not some powerful hypothetical entity that can interfere with how reality works. God is reality. And God doing something does not require suspending the laws of nature. All laws of nature is the Logos, God speaking. And it isn't only the strange and impossible things that God unfolds. Everything that is even now continuing to unfold all around us is Yahweh, God who spoke to Moses and unfolds whatever that happens. Today, this phrase, God intervenes in our world, has misled people into thinking of God as some alien force periodically interfering with our world and our lives. This has led us, for example, into thinking that in the Exodus story, God interfered with a Pharaoh's mind controlling him to harden his heart, whereas what this account really describes is how the Pharaoh's own mind worked, or failed to work in this case, and that how is part of reality, and God is reality. There is a reason, though, why the Jews, the Christians, and others who believe in God say that God intervenes in our world. And it's not about when God is doing something, it's more about us. It's about when God is doing something for us. Because everything is God speaking, yes, but not everything is about us. For Christians, an undiscovered dark matter planet in some distant galaxy would be God speaking, but presumably not to us since, we can't know about it. In fact, the Bible has several examples like this in its very first chapter in Genesis, when God speaks to things long before human beings ever existed. But there are times when something that happens is God speaking to us, and this sets that thing apart from the normal course of events in that it is about us. All of reality is God speaking, but at times, God speaks a specific thing that reality will unfold for us. And it is in that sense that God intervenes. But then, here's the question. What makes something that happens God doing this? And how do we tell? More importantly, what does that thing actually mean for us? Is it a punishment, for example, or a reward for someone else, or a message? And if it's a message, just what is God speaking to us? So, say that a river turns to blood, or something like blood. What makes that God doing something specific for us? And what does it mean? These would have been the questions that were confronting the people in the story of Exodus. And the answer involves not just people, but nature and all of creation. For just as everything is God speaking, God speaks to everything. And really, this is what we should have been saying instead of saying that God intervenes in our world. Welcome to What Do You Mean God Speaks, where we explore important ideas, insights, and stories in Christianity. For the skeptics who want to understand religion, Christians who have questions about their own beliefs, and everyone in between. I am Paul Sung-ho-jung, and this is our 6th episode of the 4th season. What do you mean God intervenes? The plagues and what God was speaking to Egypt and everything else. The plagues of Egypt, also called the 10 plagues, were described in the Exodus account as the following. First, the Nile River became like blood. Second, frogs came out of the water in mass to overrun the land. Then third, dust of the earth turned to gnats that came upon people. The swarms of flies followed them as the 4th plague, followed by the 5th, which was a disease that struck the livestock. Then 6th was boils that broke out on people's skins. The 7th was a catastrophic hailstorm, followed by the 8th, which was a strong wind that brought a horde of locusts that covered the land, and then the 9th was a dense shroud of darkness that covered the sky and choked off all light. The 10th was the death of every firstborn male, both human and domesticated animals. Now, we're going to explore the 10th plague in the next episode because this final plague seems to be different from the others in a fundamental way. Anyway, before each plague, Moses and Aaron declared to Pharaoh and his court what specific plague that Yahweh will unfold next in response to their refusal to let the Hebrew slaves go and meet their God. Now, there have been a number of efforts in the past 2 centuries or so to explain the 10 plagues scientifically. Most of these offer a variation of this following general account. So first, there is this rare but well-documented phenomena called the red algae bloom. Caused by various environmental and climate factors such as drought, toxic algae can multiply in a slow-moving river, turning the water red and killing the fish and releasing toxic fumes into the air. This starts a domino effect, as the frogs will leave the contaminated water in mass only to die on land. Then without fish or frogs, the insect population such as flies would explode. There's this one gnat-like species that would multiply by feeding on decomposing fish and frogs, and they are known to transmit potentially fatal disease to cattle, horses, and sheep. The flies, as well as the infected livestock, are known to often result in bacterial infection that causes boils on humans. Also, roughly around the time that Exodus story is supposed to have taken place, there was this massive volcanic eruption relatively near Egypt in the Aegean Sea, which blew apart an entire island. Such volcanic eruption can cause massive hail to fall even in Egypt, and it can also result in a strong wind that will carry a swarm of locusts. Such swarm of locusts, by the way, tend to form during drought, the kind that can cause the red algae bloom. And of course, the volcanic eruption would send a dense cloud of pumice and ash into the air that would have covered the sky in darkness. But this explanation raised this following question. Are the 10 plagues in Exodus then something that God did or just natural events? And one response by mainstream biblical scholars have been to dismiss these speculations about the possible natural causes of the plagues because the Exodus account, according to them, clearly describes them as supernatural events. They point, for example, to the timing of the plagues or how Moses had declared beforehand the coming plagues, or perhaps even controlled them. However, I would say that the entire question about whether the plagues were natural or supernatural is a fruitless one. So, generally speaking, a supernatural event is when something happens which is beyond what is possible with laws of nature. But on the one hand, we can never know with perfect certainty whether something is natural or supernatural in this way. Now, does God do things in the Bible that are supposed to be impossible according to our scientific understanding of the world? And the answer is yes, yes indeed. But that's according to what we know so far. And we don't know for sure what really are the laws that govern and order our world. See, science gives us our best answer so far of what those laws may be, but it's never a perfect knowledge. Then on the other hand, for monotheistic religions like Christianity, any event that we can explain scientifically is still God speaking, the same as any event that we cannot. Remember, all laws of nature is the logos, which is God speaking. So anything in nature that follows such laws is still something that God unfolds. Now, does God unfold things that do not follow such laws according to Christianity? And the answer is maybe. But remember, those laws are God speaking. So this would mean that God is speaking forth exceptions to what God is speaking, which is an odd thing to say. But still, the answer is maybe. But the problem is, again, we cannot know. So to sum up, we can't answer whether something that happens is natural or not. And either way, both are God speaking anyway. So the real question is, how are the plagues that struck Egypt in the Exodus account different from, well, just any other natural disaster that happens periodically all over the world? And by the way, there are a number of examples of such disasters in the Bible itself. Remember the story of Joseph in Genesis. God said to Pharaoh and Joseph that a terrible famine will strike and God will surely bring it about. But the reason why this will happen seems to have nothing to do with humans. Instead, God spoke to Pharaoh through his dreams and enabled Joseph to interpret them so that Egypt could prepare for this disaster by storing up food to save not only its own people, but even those outside its borders. So here, the plague that struck Egypt seems to be a part of some natural course of events that God is always speaking, and what God spoke to human beings was how they are to deal with it. And in a way, this is the story of how humanity has overcome various challenges that nature has thrown at us so far, whether by cooperation or wisdom, or more recently, scientific inquiry. After all, discovering truth is the same as hearing God speak. So, what's the difference between this sort of disasters and the disasters that happen in Exodus? Both kind of disasters are something God unfolds, and both may be natural events in terms of how they unfolded, following the laws of nature that God is speaking. But the difference is that the disasters in Exodus are about us, the Pharaoh to be precise. And that means that there is a difference both in how God speaks them forth and how they are experienced by us. Everything is God speaking, but it could also be said that God is speaking to everything. Now remember, whatever we say of God is an analogy. We are characterizing reality as a whole with words and images that are available to us. So reality is like a speech, unfolding like a story, and in that sense, everything is God speaking. But there is another analogy in the Bible which is actually older, and this is the analogy of God as the king whose speech commands and rules all things. This analogy is a carryover from ancient religious beliefs about many gods and their king. For example, a Hebrew name for God, El, was based on the Canaanite deity of the same name who was the creator of the cosmos and the king over all the other gods. But then we need to ask why the authors of the Bible still retain this analogy of God as the king over all creation, even though they rejected so many other ideas from that belief system. And the answer is that this analogy does describe some key aspects of our reality in ways that others can't. Reality is like a kind of speech, but it is also like a kind of society where everything is ruled by some greater power. This seemed true for the ancient times when we thought that everything was under a hierarchy of powerful and personal entities which we called gods, who in turn seemed to be ruled by some greater god or principle. But this seems true even for our current scientific age, since we still say that everything in the universe is quote-unquote governed by the laws of nature. Now you may say that that's just a poetic phrasing or whatever, but again remember, these are all analogies, and we use analogies because there's no better way to characterize what's all around us. So, for example, we use the words laws of nature because it's difficult to come up with a better wording. But there is something more to this analogy of the king than just that. Whereas the analogy of reality as speech or a story is, well, rather philosophical in nature, the analogy of God as the king is based much more on personal experience. That is, it isn't just that our world seems to be ordered and governed by something, but some of us have experienced that this speech-like reality can speak to us, and this voice always speaks the truth regarding how reality will unfold in response to what we do, and it calls us to a life of peace, justice, and truth. So this voice held a kind of authority we place on our kings, the good ones at least. And there is one key difference between authors speaking a story and kings ruling their subjects. See, characters in a story can only do what the author says, but the subjects of a king can rebel. Every analogy has its limits. Reality is like a speech because its principles and patterns can be described by our speech. Reality unfolds like a story because every time we describe how reality has unfolded so far, we always find ourselves telling some kind of story or another. But in the stories that we author, everything is fixed. Things and people in it don't truly have a life of their own, so to speak. Now, authors of really good stories often report that even they don't fully know how their stories will unfold because they don't fully control what their characters do. So, in our best stories at least, things do seem alive, but we also know that they only seem to. At least, they're not alive, or more precisely, autonomous to the extent that we are. The limit of one analogy invites another to supplement it. All of reality is God speaking, unfolding like a story. But the story of God truly is alive in ways that our best stories can only imitate. For God's story is populated by us, who can hear what is being spoken, and sometimes we hear God speaking directly and personally to us like a good king. But we can ignore that, or even rebel against it. See, this is what people like Moses have experienced in the Bible. They heard God speaking to them, and they found that they can follow what God speaks or ignore it or even go against it. But then they thought, what if that's how it is like with all of creation? Not quite in the sense that other created things like, say, the sun can go against what God is speaking and not rise in the morning or something, but in the sense that God speaks not just to us, but to all things. And these other things are following what God is speaking to them like we're doing, or in our case, sometimes we're doing. Perhaps they may not be free in the ways that we are, but they too have some level of autonomy, of freedom. Now, just how much freedom they have is a question that is still being debated. For example, a more recent school of thought in Christianity called process theology holds that nature can actually go against what God is speaking to it, like we humans can, at least to some extent. And that's because, according to this view, God grants this kind of freedom to all created things and is always choosing to persuade creation to follow what he speaks rather than compelling them to do so. For most Christians, though, this position seems to go a bit too far. But still, the debate is about the degree, not whether things in nature have some freedom, but about how much. And all of this isn't just some idle speculations of theologians with nothing better to do. It is this paradoxical idea of God in which the entire universe is the speech of God, the Logos, yet at the same time is also autonomous from God so that it hears and freely follows that speech. This dual idea of God historically led to the emergence of modern science in the West. But we'll have to leave that topic for another time because this episode is long as it is. So for this episode, what we are interested in is what this idea, this analogy, actually means for how those of us who believe in God understand what is happening all around us. And we already explored the answer from a different angle in Season 3 in a supplemental episode 17.17. I seem to reference this episode a lot nowadays. So on the one hand, everything we are doing is part of reality, which is to say, a part of God speaking. Yet on the other hand, things we do are our own actions and decisions. So things you do, like say taking in an abandoned puppy by the roadside, is God speaking, but also what you did. A dry season that brings drought one year is God speaking, but also what the climate of our planet brings about. And putting both together means that, in a sense, we, and that's both humans and nature, take part in what God speaks. It is God speaking, but we fill in the content, you can say. We can perhaps think of it this way. What God speaks composes the range of things that we can do, a range of possibilities. The word I used before was parameters. Now, we may call these parameters or this range laws of nature or fate or something else, but whatever it is, some things in our reality is fixed. It is what it is, or rather, since this is something that God is speaking as Yahweh, remember the meaning of the name, maybe it's more proper to say, I am that I am, and I cause to be what I cause to be. Anyway, we're still free to do whatever within this fixed larger range that God is speaking. And what we do fills in the specific content of what God then speaks and unfolds. However, people in the Bible have found that God does not just leave us alone to do this, to fill in the content however we want. God spoke to them personally through various ways regarding what content will make their lives flourish together and what will make them perish together. God spoke to them like a parent, a teacher, or a good and just king. And people like Abraham or Moses followed what God spoke, and the content of what unfolded in their lives were what God said they will be and what God promised they will be. Everything that unfolds is God speaking, but the specific content of what unfolded in their lives were born from their interaction with God who spoke to them like a good king. Follow me so far? And according to this idea of God, God likewise speaks to nature like a good king. Now, everything in nature, the entire universe or the multiverse, if that exists, is God speaking. But God also speaks a set of principles or parameters or laws within which everything exists and also within which everything can be free. And that is what it means for there to be happenstances and randomness in nature, by the way. They are expressions of nature's freedom. And this sense of freedom is mentioned in various parts of the Christian Bible, a freedom within a range of parameters that God speaks. So, for example, in the book of Job, God is said to have spoken to the waters of the sea, which again means more than just H2O, but something like the physical substance of chaos or manifestation of infinite possibilities. And God spoke to this water, setting just how far it can move and where it must stop. Freedom within parameters. Then there's also the Genesis creation account, where God speaks to living things and commands them to flourish and fill the world, yet seemingly leaving the specifics of how to do that up to them. And what they do in turn fills in the content of what God speaks and unfolds as Yahweh. And this would be what evolution is for the scientists. However, there are times when God speaks to things in nature as their king and calls them to do specific things to fill in the content of what God will speak in a specific way. But unlike we humans, everything else in creation will always hear and follow what God speaks. And that is what was happening when God was bringing forth the plagues upon Egypt. All of nature is God speaking, but God was also speaking to nature, and it obeyed like loyal knights obeying their king. Having said that, though, it's actually rather difficult to pinpoint just which part of nature or whatever else it is that God would have spoken to unfold these plagues. Here's one example. So, the 8th plague that struck Egypt was a vast swarm of locusts. So, did God speak to the locusts? Well, according to the Exodus account, what brought these locusts was a strong wind which Yahweh caused to blow for an entire day and night, and likewise what took them away was another wind. So, if you want to be exact about it, it seems that in this case at least, God spoke specifically to the wind, or whatever it is that made this wind blow, while to the locusts, God did not speak anything further beyond what they normally do anyways, which is to devour every plant matter they can find. But the real problem for us is that while all this may sound interesting on paper, there is no practical way for us to tell the difference. That is, these events in themselves do not tell us whether there is something that God specifically spoke to nature to unfold, or whether there are things that God is speaking forth as just one of the many things that nature can unfold at any time. Now, according to what we've said so far, there is a difference on God's end, but we are not privy to that. Unless, that is, there is something more, something that tells us what God is doing. And that something is always a person who speaks with God, a person like Moses. Too often, we tend to unthinkingly assume the answer of why God does some specific thing in the Bible. For example, why did God strike Egypt with plagues? And most of us assume that these plagues were simply God punishing Pharaoh for keeping the people of Israel enslaved. But according to Exodus, that is not quite what is going on. Remember what I said back in Season 3, that miracles are first and foremost forms of communication. Very often, miracles, both good and the bad, unfold to authenticate what God is personally speaking to people. In fact, this is what God quite straightforwardly says to Pharaoh in the Exodus account before the Nile River became like blood, saying that, quote-unquote, by this you will know that I am Yahweh. That is to say, the plagues will show that the voice that spoke to Moses and is now speaking to Pharaoh and his court really is speaking forth everything that is happening around them, which is again part of the meaning of the name Yahweh. So these plagues authenticate what Moses is speaking to them as something that God is speaking. And sometime later, God speaks to Pharaoh and his court again, saying that the next series of plagues, starting with a swarm of flies, then a sickness that will spread among livestock, will strike Egypt while specifically avoiding the region where the Hebrew slaves live. Then God declares that these things will unfold in this specific manner, quote-unquote, so that you may know that Yahweh is in this land and that I am making a distinction between my people and yours. All of that is to say, the way these plagues will strike will confirm that what is going on really is about the Hebrew slaves and not something else. That reality is specifically unfolding these disasters because Egypt is keeping them enslaved and refusing to let them go meet their God. Then, before the seventh plague, the storm of thunder and hail, God outright says that Egypt is actually being spared from a plague that could have very well killed every living person. God was keeping them alive, quote-unquote, so that you may know that there is no one like me to show you my power and make my name resound throughout the world. And when I first read this, I thought that this was about God showing off how powerful he is to the rest of the world. But then I was struck with this question. Why would making the plagues less severe and sparing Egypt show off God's power? Wouldn't it be better to do the opposite? I mean, okay, if you want to be sadistic about it, you may make them suffer for a while, but at the end, you would still finish them off for good so that everyone else would know not to mess with you. So what God seems to mean by showing his power do not seem to mean what many of us think it means. It's not simply about the magnitude of power. After all, the power of all of reality would be, well, infinite. It again seems to be about communication. The voice that spoke to Moses can unfold whatever that is needed to unfold for Egypt and its rulers to listen to him. The show of power here is about how this God cannot be ignored, well, any more than any of us can ignore reality. But the thing is, we do exactly that. We often ignore reality, ignore the truth of what is going on until disasters strike. The entire thing today about environmental catastrophes such as climate change is exactly that same story with the same inevitable conclusion, which is we can ignore reality, but only up to a point. The same can be said of many poor decisions that we make in life, whether it's about addiction or toxic relationships or whatever else. Because things will unfold with greater and greater magnitude. They will become worse and worse until we can no longer ignore what's going on. That is, no longer ignore reality, which is God speaking. And that is the story of the plagues in Exodus. Because Pharaoh and his court have been ignoring what God is speaking to them, God speaks louder, and louder means greater and greater disaster. So in the Exodus account, plagues arrive with greater and greater intensity as time goes on. The first plague, the Nile River becoming like blood, was a disaster, but people could dig wells for drinking water. frogs and gnats that followed were more of a painful nuisance than actual threats to life. Then something more severe struck, like sickness and even some deaths among livestock, and then painful boils on people's skins. The hailstorm and hordes of locusts that followed were actual catastrophes. The increasing magnitude of the later plagues is the increasing loudness of what God is speaking. Yet still, this is not about destruction, but communication. It is about how God that truly unfolds all things without limit has been speaking to Egypt. And God cannot speak to Egypt if everyone there is killed. The show of power is the power to be heard. Think about what it means for us human beings to communicate something. Say you want to communicate that the liquid in this container is poisonous. Perhaps you will write the word poison on the bottle or have a drawing of a skull. Now, neither the letters P-O-I-S-O-N nor the picture of a skull is poison itself. They point to something else, which in this case is the fact that liquid is poisonous. Likewise, for the ancient readers of the Bible, what we now call natural events can point to something else, like letters of a word or pictures can. They mean more than just a thing that happened, but also an idea or an aspect to reality. So, for example, a flood is of course a literal flood of water, but it also means an overflow of chaos and unraveling of our ordered world. And so, each specific plague that struck Egypt would have had specific meaning for those who experienced it, meaning for the Egyptians and their culture. First, the Nile River was the primary source of Egypt's wealth and power. The longest river in the world continued to flow even during the worst droughts, so that Egypt always had water to drink, even when others did not. The river also served as formidable natural defense, as well as means of transportation, securing the nation against both military and economic dangers. And the flooding of its banks that occurred every year without fail made the land very fertile, so that Egypt would always have some food even when others did not. This is why when there were famines in the time of Abraham and then Isaac, they went to Egypt. This is also why God spoke to Pharaoh and Joseph before a 7-year famine, so that he was able to store up enough food, not just for itself, but other nations as well. Egypt was the nation for this job. And it is that river that turned to blood. With the very first plague, reality unfolded something that overturned the very foundation of the life of Egypt, turning it into a symbol of death. And the abundant food that this river ensured were later struck down by hail and then devoured by hordes of locusts. The river turning to blood, or the hailstorm or the hordes of locusts, are God speaking, as is everything else that happens, but what they meant for the Egyptians who experienced them were something very specific. These things were saying, your source of life can just as well become a symbol of death. Power and wealth that you thought were secure can be taken away from you at any time. Reality can unfold these very things, so stop hardening your heart and listen to that which unfolds all things, the voice that spoke to Moses and is now speaking to you. The other plagues meant something even more specific. If you ever saw murals and statues from Egypt, you may have noticed that most of their gods have animal heads. The frogs and livestock were associated with various Egyptian gods, just like, say, the eagle is the symbol of the United States of America. So imagine what it would be like for the US if a sudden plague killed most of these eagles overnight. And it was worse for Egypt, as the frogs fled from the Nile, Egypt's source of life and power, to die on land, and livestock became deathly ill. The 9th plague was especially devastating in this way. The greatest god of Egypt at this time was the sun god. They believed that the sun was the first being to exist and ordered the cosmos and ruled over all creation. Egyptians believed that this sun god rose from the sky every day to bring his light and warmth upon the world, and every night descended into darkness to fight off the great monster and serpent of chaos, Apep. Yet God that spoke to Moses spoke forth this darkness which covered the sky, and in the Egyptian eyes, the darkness that their God fought and defeated every night had now devoured him. Biblical scholars say that the authors of Exodus were writing polemics against the gods of Egypt, and this is quite true. But this is not simply about arguing that my God is stronger than your gods, like how comic book enthusiasts, for example, would argue over which superhero or which supervillain is stronger. By the way, I believe that many comic books, especially the series that are particularly influential, draw heavily upon themes and ideas of ancient mythology and its gods. But for the ancients, their gods were obviously far more than something like comic book figures, and their religious ceremonies were more than comic book conventions. If anything, it would be for today comic book conventions, yes, but also religious mass, art exhibits, philosophy lectures, and science symposiums all put together. And the gods, their gods, were entities that connected them to reality, to different aspects of reality, to nature, to their world, to sky, earth, and waters, to principles like order, justice, and truth. And when the plague struck Egypt, they were either being overpowered or were turning their back on Egypt and its pharaoh. Remember the idea of Ma'at we've examined in the previous episode? It's the Egyptian concept of truth, order, and justice. They believed that their gods ordered and ruled the cosmos by this principle of Ma'at, and human beings, including the pharaoh, must also live by it. If they failed to do so, the world would unravel into chaos and the gods would lose their power to protect Egypt. And the plagues that unfolded in Exodus would have shown that this was what was going on. For the Egyptians and their worldview, what was happening would have conveyed as clear as written words or drawn paintings that their nation's relationship to the divine, to even their own gods, had become profoundly tainted. And as Moses and Aaron continued to speak to Pharaoh, it would have become clear that this was because of their refusal to listen to this God Yahweh that was calling their Hebrew slaves into the desert. The plagues were first and foremost communication. They were how God was speaking to Egypt and its rulers who had been refusing to listen otherwise. Yet if we were to remember that the plagues that struck Egypt differ from other natural events that God speaks and unfolds, in that God was specifically speaking to things in nature to unfold these things, just as God can specifically speak to us human beings, a very interesting idea emerges. It means that God spoke to Moses to go and speak to Pharaoh, and then God spoke to nature to go and speak to Pharaoh. God was sending not only Moses and Aaron, but all of creation to relate to Pharaoh and Egypt what God was speaking to him. That is what the plagues of Exodus were. That is, except the final plague, the 10th, the most terrible of them all. For not every plague was about communication. The 10th was judgment. For the ancients, the death of every firstborn meant the death of their future. The first 9 plagues were first and foremost communication, but what it was communicating was a dire warning. They were the tremors before the earthquake, symptoms of an impending fatal heart attack. That was why they grew in intensity. God was speaking louder and louder. If they did not heed what God was speaking to them, what will fall upon them would be the judgment that had been in waiting all this time, the real plague. And this judgment was over not just the Pharaoh, not just the Egyptians, but all living things dwelling in that land, including, it turns out, the enslaved people of Israel and even Moses himself. For what would save you from the 10th plague was not your power, ethnicity, or even whether you were the oppressors or the oppressed. It was an unlikely thing, a thing that no one would know, and one you can only know if you have been hearing God personally speak to you. So join me next episode to explore the dreaded 10th plague and what saved you from it. A lamb, the Lamb of God. Thank you so much for listening and waiting during the past unplanned hiatus. Your continued support and encouragement keeps me going. So please follow, subscribe, and share this series with others, and rate it on your Apple, Spotify, and other platforms that let you do so. You can also support this series at buymeacoffee.com, which you can go to by clicking on the line Support the Show in the episode description. And I will meet you in the next episode.